Virginia Woolf is a British modernist author. She was born in 1882, worked as a publisher, a literary critic, a novelist, was a phenomenal contributor to what the novel looked like in the 20th century, and she was also a key member of the Bloomsbury Group, which was a slightly controversial but really important group of thinkers, artists, social critics, novelists who discussed the social conditions and political conditions of the era. Virginia Woolf chose to reject the narrative forms that they'd inherited from the Victorian era. So that manifested itself in a couple of ways. The first way she revolutionized the form was in abandoning the traditional omniscient voice that novels had in the 19th century. She chose to use what they call stream of consciousness voice, where she could explore characters' minds and not be limited. She could be in one character's mind in one moment and seamlessly flow into another's within the same sentence without even indicating it to the audience. And then I think the second way she changed things was that she really cared about everyday experiences and everyday people. So instead of grand events, she could have an entire novel like Mrs. Dalloway. By embodying that character for one day, she really gets to explore what it means to have crucial thoughts and feelings of the everyday person. When Woolf publishes Shakespeare's Sister, it's in 1929. So it's 11 years after the Act of Parliament that gave some women in the UK access to the right to vote.
So what the women's rights movement did was to start to question those assumptions about coverture. It's an Italian phrase that means woman covered or covered by her husband. So if you're femme sole, you're single, you have your own identity. You are sole or solo or single. When you're married, you are covered by your husband. And so literally you become his property. So the women's rights movement began to question each one of those things little by little, like gradually, almost like a checklist, and begin to say women actually should have their own rights to their own person, their own body, their own property by virtue of being a human being and not by virtue of being married.
Woolf herself, while she's giving a feminist voice and perspective, she wasn't necessarily what you would consider an active part of the suffrage movement, right? Not necessarily on the picket lines, though she's for it. She's speaking to those who are attending colleges and are earning degrees and are about to enter the workforce, and she's inviting and challenging them to carry on in the fight. She's engaged in how, as artists, modernists were trying to place value on the individual and the individual experience and their thoughts. So she creates an individual, Judith, that can stand as a representation, but she's also extending a very personal one-on-one challenge to these women as they enter the workforce, as they continue to face resistance, maybe some prejudices and biases, that their struggle is worthwhile, and they think that they can look to her as a pillar of someone who's engaged in that and is succeeding. So Shakespeare's Sister is an excerpt from her extended essay, A Room of One's Own. She published that in, I believe, 1929, and it was based on a couple of lectures that she'd given to women at women's colleges. And her intent was to explore the answer to what would have happened, how would our lives be different if William Shakespeare had had a sister, and who better to pick than Shakespeare, right? If she's going to really emotionally express the gravity of what we've lost in not having women who've historically had the same resources, there's no bigger stage than Shakespeare. So she uses him as a really apt comparison. Again, not because she doesn't enjoy Shakespeare herself, but because he's the greatest writer to make the comparison to. would we know history and literature differently if that had been so? And ultimately, she argues that had he had a sister, Judith, because of the structures of the society in which she lived, she wouldn't have been able to share her voice with the world, even if she had the same talent and aptitude he has.
For many, many centuries, there wasn't really a lot of question as to women's roles in society. Over time, because men controlled all of the military power and the political power and the religious power, then by default that was seen as those are the things that men do and women aren't even allowed in those roles. And over time, then even laws and limitations and prescriptions are put into place that keep women out of those roles. And so for our society in particular, because we were primarily a British society, we took the form of what was called English common law, which basically wrote into statutes all kinds of ways that women were kept in their place.
I don't think Virginia Woolf means to insult Shakespeare, but I think she wants to point out that he's obviously male and writes from a male perspective. He excelled at psychologically complex characters, and even though what he has is of great value, we're missing that female perspective, which is something that Judith could have offered. William has some phenomenally important female characters. Ophelia, much has been written about her. He also has some rather terrible portrayals of women. The Taming of the Shrew. So there are great examples of characters, but there are weak examples. And I think Virginia Woolf is positing that had we had a Judith Shakespeare, she could have extended the possibility of what a female character could have looked like because it would have been written from her perspective.
There's the stereotype that all women are for the purposes of child rearing, child caring, those kinds of things, but also because women weren't allowed to be educated in most societies, then that lent itself to women being not as intelligent, or women being more emotional than men. And certainly we could get into the biology of, are women more likely to be emotional than men, and what are the innate characteristics of men and women. But whatever those innate characteristics, in many societies those are denigrated or seen as less than. That if men are rational, that's seen as a positive trait. Women are emotional, that's a negative trait, rather than a more appropriate way would be that both rationality and emotion are both good in humans. Instead, it's seen as this binary opposite. Men are one thing, women are the other.
So Woolf is capable and creates a wonderful legacy in these complex characters, and that was something that Shakespeare also created. So maybe in her own way, Woolf is her own Judith Shakespeare. Woolf posits that to be a writer, you have to have both financial and material resources, in addition to a society that's supportive of the path you want to pursue. And Woolf herself says that if you don't have that material space or the financial resources, how are you supposed to produce art that's of value? And I think as college students, they can be sympathetic to this idea that if I'm going to go out in the world and create my art, if I can have a space and an environment that supports me, how much better can I pursue my craft? Woolf creates Judith almost as a martyr. She stands as a symbol for women across generations, someone we can look to and aspire to. Judith didn't have the chance to share her talent with the world, and there are a lot of other elements of that section of the essay where she's exploring what an individual needs in order to succeed. And that's where she posits that a writer needs access to material resources, to financial resources, and social structures that are supportive. She sees this now as a possibility that it hasn't been historically before. She still encounters much resistance that she writes about, but she sees it now as a possibility that it hadn't been before. So this essay is to encourage that fight because it's an avenue that's opening.
Throughout history, we've had women that have been maybe writers. That's a common one. A lot of women have chosen to be authors, poets, writers.
As an author, Woolf has to make the choice to kill her character. Even though she loves Judith and what she represents and possibilities, the reality is that she ends her life in this story. She says she likely would have been with child and would have taken her life on a winter's night in a crossroads. Woolf herself was very sympathetic to mental health struggles. She herself struggled with depression. She was intimately familiar with that. But I think more so, she's trying to be sympathetic to what life was like during that era and what it would mean for an artist to be denied the avenue to pursue their craft, which is sad for the readers, but it's realistic. Judith couldn't have lived, meaning she couldn't have thrived. She couldn't have been the artist because she just didn't have that social support. And so as she speaks to women in 1929 and beyond, she makes her a symbol of what we can aspire to pay tribute to. In fact, I think even in the present day, there's a writer, Margaret Atwood, and she wrote a book called Negotiating with the Dead. And she takes this idea of Judith Shakespeare, and she says that there are women in the past who weren't able to share their voices or their stories, but as we reconsider the past and what they would have experienced, we pay honor to them and we tribute them. And I think that all comes down to Judith and what Woolf created for us. And I think that conversation about the worth of an individual and what one person can do is really empowering and exciting. So I hope that that continues to be shared with voices and people all over.